I want you to start this deep dive by engaging in a very specific cognitive exercise with us.
Yeah, a bit of a thought experiment to get us grounded.
Right. So I want you to imagine your most difficult memory.
Just whatever comes to mind first.
Exactly. Whatever it is, just for a brief moment, try to pull it up into your conscious awareness. Notice the sensory details that immediately begin to populate your mental space.
The environment.
Yeah, the specific quality of the lighting in the room, the micro expressions on the faces of the people involved, the colors.
The physical architecture of the space where it happened.
Right. You can likely see it playing out like a high-definition movie clip right in front of your eyes. It's rendered there, projected onto the screen of your consciousness, complete with the emotional weight it carried the day it actually happened.
Which is how most of us process these things.
But now, I want you to shift the parameters of this exercise entirely. I want you to imagine trying to recall that exact same terrifying, painful event, but when you look for the visual data.
The imagery.
Yeah, when you look for it, the screen in your mind is completely blank.
Just nothing.
A total, absolute visual void, no colors, no faces, no cinematic playback at all. Just quiet, dark space containing only the semantic facts of what occurred.
It is a profoundly jarring shift in perspective, especially for anyone accustomed to a highly visual internal world.
It really is.
For a significant portion of the population, autobiographical memories, especially our most intense, negatively valenced ones, are intrinsically tied to the visual reconstructions we simulate in our prefrontal cortex.
We see the past.
We do.
Yeah.
So to theoretically strip that rendering capacity away, it fundamentally alters the very architecture of how an individual interacts with their own past.
And that architectural shift is the exact foundation of our mission today. We are pulling from a highly focused singular source for this deep dive.
It's an excerpt from a really fascinating text.
Right. A text titled The Blind Shield, Aphantasia as Trauma Protection. And our mission today is to explore what feels like a really massive paradigm shift in how we understand memory consolidation, mental health, and the literal neurological mechanics of how our brains process traumatic events.
The premise we are examining is incredibly specific, but it carries vast clinical and philosophical implications.
Huge implications.
We're analyzing a text that focuses on a neurological condition called aphantasia. The text defines this as having a blind mind's eye.
The literal inability to voluntarily conjure mental imagery.
Exactly. But rather than approaching this through the traditional pathological lens, as a deficit or a cognitive failing, the source posits that this visual blindness might actually serve as an active emotional shield.
Okay, let's unpack this, because what strikes me immediately is how counterintuitive this is.
Oh, absolutely.
We are so culturally and scientifically wired to view a loss of a sensory or cognitive function as a deficit.
It's something broken.
Right. We spend vast amounts of resources researching how to improve memory recall, how to enhance visualization for sports performance or whatever. And suddenly this text introduces the idea that lacking this specific function could actually operate as a profound defense mechanism.
It completely upends how we look at mental resilience.
It totally does.
What's fascinating here is how the text immediately subverts our typical, almost universally accepted clinical understanding of trauma.
Yeah, we aren't just exploring the condition of aphantasia as some quirky neurological footnote.
No, we are going to dive deep into the very mechanics of how the human nervous system experiences distress. By examining what happens when the visual component of episodic memory is absent, we are forced to re-examine the heavy lifting that imagery actually does in our day-to-day suffering.
To really grasp the utility of this shield, we first have to rigorously define the weapon it's defending against.
The threat model.
Exactly. That brings us to how the text breaks down that threat. The text specifically targets post-traumatic stress disorder, and it notes that PTSD is often triggered by intrusive, negative imagery.
Those specific words are so important.
Intrusive, negative imagery, triggered. They paint a very specific mechanical picture of what trauma looks like at the neurological level.
The clinical vocabulary used in this source text is extraordinarily deliberate. Let's start by dissecting the word intrusive.
Let's do it.
It tells us everything we need to know about the pathology of the trauma. The text does not frame these traumatic images as voluntary, declarative memories.
Right, it doesn't say PTSD is triggered by just remembering an event.
Exactly. An intrusion is a breach of cognitive security. These images are forceful visual interruptions into a person's consciousness.
They bypass the brain's executive functioning.
Specifically, the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate focus. and they demand immediate, overwhelming physiological attention from the amygdala.
The source text actually includes a really compelling case study to illustrate this exact mechanism. They refer to a patient named David.
The car crash survivor.
Yeah, a survivor of a catastrophic multi-car pileup. The text details how David isn't just sitting at his desk remembering that he's in a crash.
He's not just pondering it.
No.
Yeah.
He's looking at a spreadsheet, and suddenly his visual field is hijacked by the glaring, blinding headlights of the oncoming truck.
It's immediate.
He sees the shattered glass suspended in the air. The imagery doesn't just inform him of the past, it violently overwrites his present reality.
David's case is a textbook example of how the visual cortex essentially acts as a rogue projector during a PTSD episode.
A rogue projector, I love that phrasing.
The brain's default mode network, which typically handles our internal narrative and daydreaming, is totally hijacked by the trauma memory, and that leads directly to the next critical concept the test introduces. Yes, the source discusses how this intrusive imagery causes the brain to be reliving the trauma. What is absolutely crucial to note here is the text's emphasis on the fact that, to the amygdala, there is no conceptual difference between a highly vivid internal image and a real-world threat.
Because the amygdala cannot tell time.
The amygdala cannot tell time.
That is such a vital point for you to understand as you listen to this. The conscious, rational part of David's brain knows he is sitting in an office chair looking at a spreadsheet.
He knows he's safe.
But the fear center of his brain is responding to the high-fidelity visual data of the headlights.
Precisely. By emphasizing the concept of reliving, the text is acknowledging a tragic neurological illusion.
The physical event is in the past.
However, because the visual recall is so intensely rendered in the mind's eye, it tricks the autonomic nervous system into initiating a full-scale fight-or-flight response.
The imagery is the time machine.
It drags the somatic experience of the present back into the terror of the past.
Let me throw out an analogy to try and ground the mechanics of this, because the separation of rational knowledge and somatic experience is tricky.
It's very counterintuitive.
Think about the difference between reading a factual police report of an event versus wearing a highly advanced virtual reality headset.
Okay.
A standard non-traumatic memory is like the police report. You have the semantic data, you know the sequence of events, you know the outcome, but the cognitive distance remains intact.
You are separate from the document.
Exactly. But the PTSD experience described in this text, with this intrusive imagery, that is like being forced into a VR simulation that is strapped to your face and locked in place, playing a horrifying movie on a continuous loop.
It's all-encompassing.
You aren't just reading about the event. Your brain is completely immersed in the illusion that the threat is currently active.
The VR analogy is a good starting point for understanding the immersive nature of visual flashbacks. But let's push back on that for a second because it's a bit too neat.
Fair enough.
We have to remember that trauma isn't exclusively visual. The body keeps the score, as the prevailing literature dictates.
Right, the somatic memory.
Auditory flashbacks, olfactory triggers, or purely somatic experiences, like a sudden, inexplicable tightening of the chest, can still trigger that autonomic response.
So it's not just the screen.
No. A person can experience a profound PTSD episode triggered by the smell of a specific brand of motor oil without ever seeing a visual flashback. So, while the visual component is a massive driver of the pathology, we must be careful not to reduce PTSD entirely to a visual phenomenon.
That is a very fair correction. The text itself does acknowledge that PTSD is a multisensory cluster bomb.
It absolutely is.
But its central thesis isolates the visual intrusion as the primary catalyst for the most debilitating, immersive episodes of reliving.
Because of how much processing power it uses.
Exactly. The visual cortex consumes a massive amount of our brain's resources. When that specific system is co-opted by trauma, the resulting illusion is uniquely overpowering.
That is accurate. The visual data tends to be the most overwhelming sensory input for neurotypical individuals, which makes it the most effective trigger for the amygdala's panic response.
It's the loudest alarm.
And the text is specifically isolating this visual feedback loop to set up its core hypothesis regarding aphantasia.
So as you are listening to this deep dive, hold on to that understanding of the threat architecture. Keep the image of the rogue internal projector in your mind, the visual system hijacking the present moment.
Because we are about to pivot to the exact opposite cognitive profile.
We are transitioning into the source's main subject. What happens when that internal projector simply does not exist?
What are the implications when the mind's eye is entirely structurally blind?
This is where we shift into the clinical definition and the lived experience of aphantasia as presented in the source.
The text defines aphantasia explicitly as the inability to voluntarily generate mental imagery.
Let's really drill down into the functional reality of that blind mind's eye. Based strictly on the parameters of this text and the broader research it references, we are talking about a literal physiological inability to conjure visual representations internally.
The statistics are fascinating too,
The text cites prevalence statistics suggesting that roughly 2 to 4% of the global population operates with this cognitive profile.
which is millions of people.
Yes. If you ask an aphantasic individual to close their eyes and picture an apple, they do not see a faint red shape.
They don't see a wireframe drawing either.
No. They see the back of their eyelids. The semantic understanding of the apple, its color, its texture, its taste is perfectly intact.
But the visual rendering software simply does not run.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of memory encoding and retrieval, the implications are staggering.
Truly. Think about what this means for the fundamental architecture of autobiographical memory.
Right.
Historically, episodic memory, the memory of autobiographical events, has been thought to be inextricably linked to visual re-experiencing.
Seeing the past to remember the past.
Exactly. If the mind's eye is blind, how does the brain store and retrieve the narrative of a human life?
The individual is still learning, forming complex emotional attachments, and experiencing trauma.
Of course. And the text makes it clear that the episodic memory of the event absolutely still exists. The person knows precisely what happened to them.
The format is different.
The format of the memory relies entirely on semantic and spatial data rather than visual data. It's akin to having the raw source code of a complex operating system, but completely lacking the graphical user interface to display it on a monitor.
Oh, I like that.
The operational data is flawlessly preserved, but the picture is void.
The source text introduces another fascinating case study here to illustrate this stark contrast. They introduce Elena.
The woman with congenital aphantasia.
Right, congenital meaning she's had it since birth. And she also survived a severely traumatic event, in her case, a violent home invasion.
A horrifying experience.
When Elena is asked to recall the event, her description is purely factual, almost like a meticulously organized ledger.
A ledger's a perfect word for it.
She knows the timeline. She knows the spatial layout of where she was standing versus where the intruder was standing. She can articulate the profound fear she felt at the time.
But she cannot see the intruder's face in her mind.
She cannot rewatch the moment the door was kicked in.
Elena's case highlights the profound structural difference in cognitive processing. The text inherently sets up a spectrum of internal realities.
Let's look at that spectrum.
On one extreme, we have the highly visual, chaotic, frequently intrusive internal world characteristic of severe PTSD.
Where unwanted, high-fidelity images constantly bombard the prefrontal cortex. Like David with the headlights.
Exactly. On the other extreme, we have the visually quiet, silent, structurally blind internal world of aphantasia, like Elena.
The author is asking us to place these two contrasting cognitive architectures side by side and critically observe how they interact with traumatic stimuli.
It's a fascinating study in neurological extremes.
If your internal world is visually silent, your day-to-day experience of reality must be so heavily weighted toward conceptual thinking, spatial awareness, and perhaps the present moment sensory data.
You're forced to be in the now.
You aren't constantly overlaying the present with visual ghosts of the past.
And that leads us to an important nuance the text addresses regarding the spectrum of aphantasia itself.
Because it's not always a total blackout, right?
The text notes that while voluntary imagery is absent, some individuals with aphantasia still experience involuntary imagery.
Like dreams.
Like visual dreams during REM sleep, or even brief, unbidden flashes of imagery during waking hours. This suggests that the visual hardware isn't necessarily broken.
It's the access that's the issue.
Precisely. The neurological pathways that allow the conscious mind to access and control that hardware are disconnected.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If aphantasics can sometimes experience involuntary imagery like dreams, does that mean they could still experience intrusive visual flashbacks?
That is the million-dollar question.
And the text dives into this. It suggests that while it is theoretically possible for an aphantasic to have an involuntary visual flashback, the clinical data they reviewed shows it is exceedingly rare.
Because of neural pathways.
Exactly. Because their brains don't routinely use visual rendering to process daily life, they don't default to visual rendering to process trauma. The neural pathways for visual recall simply aren't the path of least resistance.
That is a critical distinction. The brain relies on its most heavily trafficked neural pathways during a crisis.
It takes the highway, not the dirt road.
Exactly. If the visual pathway is essentially an overgrown, unused trail, the trauma data will route itself through semantic or somatic pathways instead.
Which brings us to the climax of the source's argument.
The core thesis.
We've established the threat, the intrusive visual loop of trauma triggering the amygdala. We've established the cognitive profile aphantasia as a structural absence of that visual loop
Now, the text synthesizes these points.
into its central provocative theory, that aphantasia functions as a protective shield against the development of certain trauma disorders by preventing the brain from reliving the event with visceral intensity.
Visceral intensity. We need to spend some serious time examining that phrase.
The text leans heavily on this concept.
When they use the word visceral, they are talking about the somatic nervous system. They are talking about the severe, involuntary physiological reaction to a memory.
The tachycardia, the hyperventilation.
The sudden spike in cortisol, the sheer, paralyzing panic that grips the body.
The author is proposing a very specific testable causal chain here.
Let's break down the chain. Step 1. The intrusive imagery acts as the high-fidelity trigger.
Right.
Step 2. This imagery tricks the amygdala into perceiving a present-tense threat.
The time machine effect.
And step 3. The amygdala signals the autonomic nervous system to launch a physiological defense, resulting in that visceral intensity.
So the logic of the text is that if you remove step 1, the visual imagery, you sever the chain entirely.
If the imagery causes the visceral intensity, then an inability to produce imagery fundamentally limits the visceral intensity.
Let's look at the methodology the source text uses to back this up, because it's not just theory.
No, we have data.
The author cites several preliminary psychiatric surveys comparing trauma outcomes between neurotypical visualizers and aphantasics.
And the results are telling.
The data suggests that individuals with aphantasia report significantly fewer traditional PTSD symptoms, particularly the intrusive re-experiencing cluster of symptoms.
When they recall a trauma, they experience a standard emotional response to a bad memory.
Sadness, anger, regret.
Yes, but they do not routinely experience the full-blown, systemic, physiological hijack.
It is a remarkable claim, and it brings us back to the title of the piece, The Blind Shield.
The author is reframing a neurological anomaly into an active, albeit passive, defense mechanism.
A shield is traditionally an implement you consciously raise against an attack.
But here, the shield is an innate structural feature of the mind's architecture.
It is passive in its existence, but highly active in its mitigation of traumatic fallout.
I want to try another analogy here to map out the somatic response the text is describing.
Go for it.
Imagine a large facility equipped with a highly sensitive, integrated fire suppression system. Now, let's say the memory of the traumatic event is a room filled with thick, toxic smoke.
Okay, I'm visualizing the facility.
In a neurotypical brain, the visual imagery acts as the highly sensitive optical smoke detector mounted on the ceiling.
The sensor.
The moment it registers the smoke, the memory, it triggers a deafening building-wide alarm system, drops the fire doors, and floods the building with chemical suppressants.
That massive disruptive system response is the visceral intensity.
Exactly. It paralyzes normal operations.
Okay, let's apply the aphantasic cognitive profile to that facility.
Right.
Aphantasia essentially means the building was constructed without that specific optical sensor.
The room is still filled with smoke.
Yes, the memory of the trauma is undeniably present. The security team, the conscious mind, knows the smoke is there.
They have the ledger.
But without that specific visual sensor to register it and send the panic signal to the mainframe, the deafening, paralyzing alarm does not sound.
The facility does not go into a state of total visceral lockdown.
Exactly. The smoke is contained as a known, documented fact, rather than an active, screaming crisis that shuts down the entire building. The system continues to operate, albeit with the knowledge that a hazard exists in one of the rooms.
The analogy holds up well in illustrating the severing of the visual to somatic pathway. However, the text is careful to introduce necessary clinical nuance here, and we must do the same.
We can't oversimplify it.
The text does not claim that aphantasia grants immunity to trauma. People with aphantasia absolutely still develop trauma responses.
Yet the presentation of that trauma is structurally different.
Because the visual pathway is blocked, The psychological distress often runs entirely into somatic or emotional channels.
An aphantasic individual might not see the car crash, but they might develop severe, inexplicable chronic pain.
Or profound avoidance behaviors, or deep depressive episodes. The trauma still requires processing. It simply lacks the Hollywood special effects budget.
That is a crucial caveat. It's not a magic bullet against suffering. It's a shift in the type of suffering.
But even with that caveat, the text data showing a reduction in the sheer visceral panic of reliving is profound.
It really forces us to ask, how much of our deepest emotional pain is tied specifically to our ability to literally see our past?
Is the suffering inherent in the facts of the event itself?
Or is a massive portion of the daily, grinding suffering generated by the brain's relentless, unbidden visual replay of the event?
The text strongly suggests the latter.
This raises an important question about the nature of human rumination.
If we possess the hardware to endlessly render high-definition simulations of our worst moments, are we inadvertently compounding our own psychological injuries?
The text implies that the human capacity for hyper-vivid visualization, while incredible for artistic creation and complex planning, is an evolutionary double-edged sword.
In the context of trauma, our advanced visual cortex becomes a vulnerability.
Are we torturing ourselves with our own mental projectors?
It's a heavy, unsettling thought.
And it transitions us directly into the broader philosophical and clinical heading of our source, aphantasia and mental health.
Through this highly specific lens, we are essentially being asked to reevaluate the entire concept of mental health, vulnerability, and what we define as a healthy brain.
By exploring this, the text radically challenges the traditional pathologizing medical model.
Historically, in psychiatry and neurology, a deviation from the neurotypical baseline, like the inability to visualize internally, is almost universally viewed as a deficit,
It's labeled a dysfunction.
an impairment, something that is broken and requires therapeutic intervention to fix. The foundational assumption of modern psychology has largely been that more ability, more sensory rendering, more cognitive access is inherently better.
But this source totally inverts that paradigm.
It completely flips it.
It takes this recognized deficit and posits it as a massive psychological and potentially evolutionary advantage in environments characterized by severe or repeated trauma.
It's suggesting that lacking this specific feature isn't a bug in the human operating system.
No. Rather, in a chaotic, unpredictable world, it functions as a highly effective built-in security patch.
It forces a redefinition of the term resilient. We typically conceptualize mental resilience as an active, conscious effort.
We think of it as a learned coping mechanism.
The application of cognitive behavioral techniques, or simply a form of psychological toughness, we tell people to build resilience.
Right. We associate resilience with grit. We think of it as gritting your teeth, doing the hard emotional labor, and pushing through the pain through sheer force of will.
But this text proposes that a significant component of resilience might not be about conscious toughness at all.
It could be deeply tied to the literal, mechanical way our brains format and store data at a hardware level.
If your neurological architecture formats traumatic data without the capacity for visual rendering, you are structurally, mechanically more resilient to the specific pathology of intrusive reliving.
Your hardware simply lacks the necessary components to run that specific viral code.
So it's a structural mechanical resilience entirely separate from emotional fortitude.
That changes everything about how we look at psychological vulnerability. If trauma responses are highly dependent on underlying cognitive hardware, it removes a massive layer of moral judgment or personal failing from the equation of mental illness.
It makes me wonder about the vast diversity of human neurobiology and how many other traits we currently classify as deficits or disorders might actually be hidden, context-dependent shields.
The diversity of the human connectome is its greatest evolutionary asset.
What presents as a vulnerability in one specific context, for example, an aphantasic individual struggling with tasks that require complex spatial visualization, or feeling a sense of loss that they cannot visually recall the face of a deceased loved one.
That same trait becomes an impenetrable shield in another context.
Exactly. Such as surviving a catastrophic event without developing the debilitating visual loops of PTSD. The text demands that we view cognitive profiles not as good or bad, but as highly specialized adaptations.
And what about the impact on identity? The text touches lightly on this, but it's worth expanding on.
If our identities are formed by the stories we tell ourselves about our past, how does an aphantasic identity differ from a hyperphantasic identity?
If you only have the facts of your life rather than the movie of your life, does that make you more grounded in the present moment?
The clinical anecdotes from the source suggest exactly that. Many aphantasic individuals report being highly tethered to the present
Because they cannot retreat into vivid visual daydream?
or get lost in the visual rendering of past regrets. Their cognitive bandwidth is heavily allocated to the immediate sensory environment.
In mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, the entire goal is to train neurotypical brains to stop visually ruminating on the past or catastrophizing the future and return to the present moment.
And aphantasic individuals often possess this cognitive trait structurally.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this right now?
We've spent a lot of time dissecting extreme clinical examples and neurological theories.
But what stands out to you about the architecture of your own mind? Take a deliberate moment to reflect on your own internal rendering system.
Where do you fall on the spectrum of Aphantasia?
When you picture a memory, is it a high-definition, immersive experience, or is it a little hazy, a bit degraded? Do you only see flashes, or do you see continuous film?
It is the ultimate exercise in metacognition, the act of thinking about how you think.
Exactly. And more importantly, have you ever noticed a correlation in your own life between how vividly you can picture an image and the physiological intensity of the emotion attached to it?
If a painful memory begins to fade visually over the years, does the somatic pain fade proportionally with it?
Have you ever actively tried to stop visualizing something because you knew the physical anxiety would follow? It's a profound, potentially life-altering thing to start observing the mechanics of your own internal projector.
This text provides an incredibly powerful, highly structured new framework for that self-reflection. It gives us the vocabulary to separate the fact of a memory from the rendering of a memory.
It really does. So let's take a step back and synthesize the incredible journey this deep dive has taken us on.
We started from the harrowing, complex reality of PTSD.
Defining it not merely as a psychological inability to move on, but as a mechanical neurological intrusion. We look at how the visual cortex can act as a rogue projector, forcing the amygdala to relive past horrors in the present tense.
We examined case studies like David, trapped by the high-fidelity loop of the headlights.
From there, we explored the fascinating, structurally quiet world of aphantasia, diving into what it truly means to operate with a blind mind's eye.
We looked at Elena's purely semantic recall of trauma.
And the crucial paradigm-shifting synthesis of the text was connecting those two opposing realities to formulate the theory of the emotional shield.
We unpacked the causal chain, how removing the visual component of memory encoding severs the pathway to visceral intensity.
Effectively muting the autonomic nervous system's panic alarm even when the factual data of the trauma remains entirely intact.
The text forces a complete reevaluation of what we thought we knew about mental resilience, challenging the deficit model of neurodivergence and introducing the concept of mechanical hardware-level protection against suffering.
Ultimately, the enduring value of unpacking this research is the recognition that human cognition is infinitely diverse.
Our minds are not standardized, mass-produced operating systems.
They are highly individualized evolutionary ecosystems, and what might appear to be a missing line of code by standard clinical metrics could actually, under the right environmental pressures, act as a profound life-saving firewall.
A hidden shield, written right into the neural pathways.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds directly upon the clinical implications of the text we've been analyzing today.
We've established the theory that the sheer visceral intensity of trauma is heavily dependent on the mind's internal visual projector.
So if that is mechanically true, could the future frontiers of trauma therapy involve finding pharmacological or neurological methods to intentionally, temporarily dim or mute the mind's eye?
We already see early echoes of this in therapies like EMDR.
Right, which seeks to tax the working memory and degrade the vividness of the image. But what if interventions could intentionally induce a temporary state of aphantasia?
Allowing a person to finally process the semantic facts of their past without being blinded and continually re-traumatized by the glaring, terrifying light of intrusive imagery.
Could temporary visual blindness be the ultimate cure for the pain of the past? It is a massive, incredibly exciting question for the future of neuroscience and psychology. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking hard questions, stay ruthlessly curious, and keep exploring the incredible, mysterious, and beautifully diverse inner workings of your own mind. We will catch you next time.